Greetings, class. In this installment, we're examining the question, why do people have conflicts? And this could be a long one. I'll try to keep it short, but there's a lot of different kind of conflicts. There's lots of different ways to think about what it means to have a conflict. And, there's lots of different motivations. So I'll try to cover it. Again, I'll try to keep it short, but there's a lot to this, right? We could have a whole class on different reasons people fight. And so that's it. So the different categories of conflict that we might think of are conflicts over resources, beliefs, expectations, misunderstandings, mistakes, and transgressions. In the category of misunderstandings, I'd say miscommunication. And each of these probably is worth at least a few sentences on. Resources. We have lots of resource conflict. We have finite resources in the world. We have different conflicts over people, seeking to get them. And when we broaden our scope of thinking about what resources are, we see things like, even the basis of like applying for jobs, right? If there's two people who want the same job, but only one job, right? They're competing, they're in conflict. There's a tension, especially when they know that they both want the same thing, right? It might be the same job. It might be two people are interested in the same romantic partner, right? Dispute, right? There is an underlying interest or need there, right? It is the competing interests or needs at the source of it, right? And we'll see that in a lot of this. But again, so with resources, people are in competition because there isn't always enough to go around, right? So we have a distribution dynamic where sometimes we can figure out how to share, sometimes we can't. But even when we can share, up until the point where people realize that they are going to be able to share with one another, there's a conflict because there is a tension over the threat or perceived threat for the ability to meet one's interests. Beliefs, right? We have our interests, we have our values, we have all of this stuff wrapped up sometimes in spiritual, sometimes in non-spiritual, but into belief systems. So if I believe something is right and somebody else believes something is right, and there's a contradiction there, right? There might not be any compromising our fundamental values, right? There is a conflict. We both have different belief systems about what should happen, and that segues into the next part of expectations. People engage into conflicts when they have different expectations about what's supposed to happen, how somebody was supposed to behave, what the meaning and relevance of activities are, right? What the performance is, what the words should have been, what does respect look like. We don't always have the same ideas, and when these different ideas collide, they create asymmetry over expectations, and these expectations can be a source of conflict. Sometimes a conflict is over nothing more than someone feeling that they have not been treated in the way that they deserve to be treated, right? Somebody having not been treated with respect, right? We see this in big cases, like there's recently been the announcement over the Breonna Taylor shooting where she was asleep and police officers entered the wrong apartment looking for a person who was already in custody, and she ends up dead, right? So there is a conflict, right? We can't bring her back to life, but the idea of justice would mean something, right? It would mean that the people who did wrong there and the system that did wrong there and that the rules that did not protect the public from the police, right? That all of these things, but at some level that happens at the level of belief, right? Do we have a belief that police officers are above the law, right? If a charge is made, but it's not murder, which is actually what has happened, right? My belief system says that she's dead. Somebody has murdered her. Somebody's responsible, and I'm not seeing that justice served. Um, but I also have the engagement with the fundamental belief in our due process rules, where we don't like you're innocent until proven guilty. So On the one hand, the officers involved in the shooting are getting the protection of the belief of a right to a trial and due process that the person who's dead actually didn't get. She has now been executed for a crime that allegedly somebody else has committed, right? Misunderstandings. Sometimes you say something and it doesn't mean, or it doesn't mean to the other person what you've meant for it to mean. Right? I'll get to that later. I'll get to that later might mean by the person who's saying it, I'll do that as soon as I'm done with the project I'm on. Or it might mean I will get to that when I have time. And the same is true for the person who's hearing it. So if I say I'll get to that later, and the other person wants me to do it right away, and I've meant that, but they didn't hear that, there's a conflict, right? Again, the expectations aren't being met, the interests and wants are not being fulfilled or engaged with in the way that's desired upon. We have a conflict. I'm not doing what you want me to do. That might happen, again, by misunderstanding. Yes, I fully intend to. That's what I meant. Then the person would say, well, why didn't you say, I'll get to that next? I'll get to that right away. Right? But conflict, not doing what the person wants, or not receiving what's desired. Mistakes. So sometimes we have conflicts, not because I messed up, right? Like, but I did what I wanted to do and it didn't work out the way you wanted it to. But sometimes I actually want to live up to your expectations, and I fail, right? I'm imperfect. We're all imperfect. I make a lot of mistakes, right? At whatever level I have intelligence because I've learned from some of my many mistakes, right? So we make mistakes. I meant to do, and when I meant to do and I failed to achieve that result and did not live up to the expectations, we had a conflict because my failure did not end up meeting your needs, right? That's a conflict, right? Shortcomings could be moral, they could be ethical, they could be substantive. I'm not as good at many things as I used to be. I'm learning through physical labor all the time that in my 40s, I just don't have what I used to have. I might have more muscular strength than I did at certain ages, so I might be able to lift a heavy box, but I pay a much larger price for lifting it than I used to, right? So when we have a misalignment of our own appraisal of our own capacities, then we can sometimes make promises that we can't keep. And when you break a promise, when you have a breach of that trust, that's a conflict. Not meeting the expectations, not matching up to somebody's interests or wants, right? That's conflict. And then lastly, I think there's actually the clear, transgression, the betrayal. We have conflict sometimes because people are out to get us or they do us harm. Not even by accident, but by intention. There might be different reasons that others are motivated, right? They might believe that they are acting vengefully or on purposes of making up for the justice that they didn't see in the world. They might be angry. They might have made a mistake and thought you were responsible for something. Whatever the case might be, right? There are times where people do clear wrong to others. Again, doesn't live up to the expectations of others, doesn't live up to the interests and wants and needs, creates a conflict. Sometimes that can happen because of the misalignment of belief systems or values, right? What one person thinks is good, somebody else might think of as betrayal. What one person thinks of as sharing, somebody else might think of as theft. It's, there's a lot to work out there. There might be gray area. There might be clear, hard lines, and somebody's doing wrong on purpose. But we have all of this, right? We live in a world where it's complex. The relationships and the dynamics and the expectations and the misunderstandings and the miscommunications and all of that stuff creates, right? It creates the beautiful chaos that is life. But part of the problem with the chaos is that sometimes when people don't do what we want them to, it creates problems. These problems can develop, metastasize, and they create bigger and more complex conflicts. Under all of this, we have our interests, our values, and our needs. But again, when I want to defend myself, right? And this can happen as an individual, as a community, as a state, as a country, as a nation, right? Self-defense, carrying a firearm because I want to be prepared in case somebody attacks me, might be the way I would describe it, but that may not be the way that others perceive it. The firearm I'm carrying might be, for me, self-defense, but it might be threatening to you. What's that crazy guy doing with a gun? Right? Perception is reality. We have a conflict because you perceive me as threatening or as an enemy, right? If we take it up to the state level, we have these conflicts, right? Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon. They say they want it as protection, right? To deter acts of aggression against them. The US is like, we ain't letting that happen. We can't let an enemy develop nuclear weapons. They could use it against us. Same with North Korea. Like all of this stuff, right? What one person says is self-defense, another says looks like an act of aggression, right? This is conflict, right? Conflict at its worst level. Conflict at its worst level is you have something that I want, and I'm willing to take it by any means necessary. Right? We do have these conflicts. But at its core, we have conflict because there are threats or perceived threats to the ability of one or more parties to meet their interests, values, or needs. See you on the next one.